We are getting into plot. Yay! Okay, so we have an idea. We have a setting. We have some characters. Now let's put them in a story. So there are a kind of a bunch of different ways that you can go about plotting, but there's kind of like these main categories of writers that people in the writing community have started to label themselves. So there are pantsers and there are outliners, or there's a bit of both. So some people have some ideas swirling around in their head, setting characters, magic or whatever, and they just sit down and they just write the story, whatever comes out. They don't really plan a whole lot, if anything, and they're kind of writing the story by the seat of their pants. It's kind of where the name pantser came from. And then there are people who sit down and they take this time to like plan out every scene, every chapter, everything that's going to happen to their character along the way, so that when they sit down to write, it's really easy. They know exactly what they're doing and it flows. Those are our outliners. And some people are a bit of both. Some people like to outline a little bit and then kind of just like pants explore the chapters as they go. They're like, okay, well, I know that down the line this needs to happen, but let's just see what happens in order to get there. I don't know. We're just going to roll with it. I kind of consider myself a little bit of both, generally more of an outliner. And it might take you a few books, writing a few books, to figure out what your style of plotting is. There's not one correct one. It's just very individual, what works for you. And your style might change depending on the story, the book that you're working on. Mine does. So a lot of the time I'm an outliner. I have like all of these notes, chapter by chapter. This is what I'm going to do. The last book I wrote, I was like, okay, look, I don't know what I'm doing, so I'm just going to write it. And it turned out really great. And I was like, oh, hey, maybe I should do this more often. Just like pulled it out of my head and it worked. There's not one surefire way of plotting and sitting down and writing your novel. You don't have to be a pantser. You don't have to be an outliner. You don't have to be a specific, percentage of each. It's very, like I said, 100% up to you, what you feel inside, what your muse is telling you to do. But whatever, category you put yourself in, there is something that every writer needs to know in order to create a good story, and that is story structure, the general outline of how a story should flow. So every good story follows the same general structure. This has been tried and tested for thousands of years of people telling stories, writing books, doing plays, all of this stuff. It's very consistent. And, kind of in the last century, people have really started picking up on that pattern and analyzing it. So over here, I've got Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. You probably know that most movies, theater, I guess mostly it kind of comes up in theater, but books too have like Act 1, this stuff is happening. Act 2, this stuff is happening. Act 3, this stuff is happening. It all follows the same thing. So every good story has the same elements. They have compelling characters. These characters have a goal which is thwarted by something or someone. Their journey to reach that goal is filled with trials and toils. Their conflict comes to a climax at the end, and then they overcome and they get their treasure and they become stronger and wiser and whatever. That's the general plot for every good, compelling story. So first off, we can look at story structure in our 3 acts. Act 1, the beginning of your book. This is where you meet your main character. You get to see what their life is like. You learn a little bit about the world. Then something happens that pulls your character out of their world, out of their comfort zone, and kind of thrusts them on an adventure. This can be their own choices. This can be somebody else's choices. But Act 1 is all about setting up your story, and then leading into the actual adventure. Act 2 is like the middle of your story. This is where the adventure is happening. Your character is learning new skills. They're struggling through trials. They realize who the bad guy is, and they start to learn what they need to do to stop the bad guy. And then Act 3 is the finale of your story, the final conflict between the protagonist and the antagonist. Everything that they learned up to this point comes to a climax, and hopefully your protagonist vanquishes the antagonist. They win, they get the treasure, and now they are like a changed, stronger, wiser being, for the better or for the worse. That's kind of up to you how you want to end it. There are tragedies where it doesn't end happily ever after, but a lesson has been learned and it's still satisfying in one way or another. So that's the very most basic plot structure that you can look at and use for your book. Just 3 things: beginning, middle, end, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. All right, so this is a little slightly more detailed version of the 3-act structure. We have Act 1, where we set up the story, and then you have the inciting incident, which is where the thing happens to your main character that kicks them out the door and sends them on the adventure. And then we have like these plot points where, you know, something crucial happens, your character makes a decision, and the story kind of takes a turn and gets more intense. Then we have in Act 2, the midpoint. This is kind of like the point of no return. You've crossed over. There's no going back. You have to see this through to the end. Something happens, another plot point, another crazy thing. Usually this is like the plot twist, where it's like, dun, 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 OMG, what? And that leads us to the climax, and then the resolution in Act 3. All right, so this has kind of been researched and looked into, kind of like I said in the last entry. A lot of creative writing scholarly people have looked into this and they've started to analyze it. And this area of study is what helped a man called Joseph Campbell create one unifying theory of story structure that all of the best, most memorable stories follow, and that's called the hero's journey. So if we look at Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Aragon, any of these, you know, typical epic tales that everybody knows really well, everybody loves them, well, for the most part, they all follow this structure of the hero's journey. So we're going to look at this. It's broken into Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Act 1, we have the ordinary world. We're just seeing our character living their life, introducing them normally. Harry Potter, he lives in a cupboard under the stairs with his aunt and uncle. That's it. It's kind of sad. That's it. Yeah, very ordinary. Okay. And then we have the call to adventure. Something happens and it's like, hey, you can either stay in your boring life or you can go on this adventure with me. For Harry Potter, he gets the letter to Hogwarts. Hagrid shows up. He's like, are you coming? Do you want to be a wizard? And he gets this moment to choose. Or you can refuse the call, where at first you're like, I don't want to do that. That's a bit scary. In the Hobbit movies, Bilbo Baggins literally is like, get these dwarves out of my house. I don't want anything to do with this. Leave. And he tells everybody to leave. He refuses it. He doesn't want to go. And then usually in Act 1, you meet the mentor, quote unquote, somebody who is going to help your main character learn all of the things they need to learn to grow. Harry has all of his Hogwarts professors. Frodo and Bilbo have Gandalf. Luke Skywalker has Obi-Wan Kenobi. They have this mentor figure that is going to introduce them to the ways of this new world. So that's all Act 1. Then you can see more than half of the story is going to be in Act 2. This is like the meat of your story. So they cross the first threshold. They leave their world for good. They're in this adventurous place. They have, taken the leap. Okay, then tests, allies, and enemies. This is where they're learning these new skills, they make new friends, and they realize that there are bad guys out there. And, they kind of just get like this info dump of like, okay, this is the situation. Here are all of our buddies. Here are all of the bad guys. They're figuring that out. Okay, the innermost cave. That's referring to like this big scary thing that your character is approaching. They're built, everything in the tests, allies, and enemies section is building up to this one thing that your main character has to do, this dragon that they need to face or whatever. So they're approaching, they're getting closer and closer to that goal where they know they're going to have a standoff with something. Okay, the ordeal is like the climax. They got there, they're facing the enemy. This is like a big struggle. Are they going to win? Are they going to lose? The readers don't know. But then they get the reward, they win, and this kind of like takes you into Act 3. So a lot of stories kind of sometimes the innermost cave happens a little towards more into Act 3. And like the tests, allies, and enemies stretches more through Act 2, but it's kind of up to you. The road back is where they this can either be metaphorical or really realistic. They actually go and they kind of revisit where they used to be. They reflect on, I used to be this lowly farmer boy who just wanted to go get stuff for my pod racer. I don't know. I'm mixing up, stories. But now I'm like this crazy strong Jedi with powers. The resurrection is like them realizing they're becoming this new person. They have reached all of their goals. They're stronger and wiser. And the readers get like this satisfying, like all of their hard work paid off moment. Yay. And then Return with the Elixir is kind of like metaphorically, they got the thing that they needed to save the world or whatever. So it can be very flexible, but this is kind of like just a general outline of a story structure that works for everything. For like trilogies or series books, usually really good ones will have like a mini hero's journey in each book, and then a really big overarching one that carries on throughout all of the books. So there's a lot more planning that goes into a series, but yeah, it's just kind of like these mini little journey structures fit into a larger one that encompasses the whole thing. You can also use kind of like this general structure, we'll talk about this later, but like for even just like scenes in your chapters. Like there's a beginning of your chapter and then something climactic kind of happens in your chapter, and will it get resolved in this chapter or will it get resolved in the next chapter? And this kind of like cycle happens again and again in your stories throughout the whole thing. And it doesn't have to be like an epic fantasy or sci-fi. It works in any kind of fiction story. The same thing. A little bit more of it's still pretty basic, but it's more than just like 3 acts, is this 7-point story structure. So you start by introducing your character, and then you introduce your setting, and then you introduce your conflict. Then there's a struggle to resolve the conflict. They have more try-fail cycles where they're like, okay, I got to do this thing and it doesn't work. Okay, well, I'm going to try this other thing and it doesn't work. Then you come to a climax, and then you have an ending where everything's resolved and validated. Or you can get even crazier and more detailed. This is just an example of something somebody put together where you have Act 1, Act 2, and there's an Act 3 as well, which I'll show you in a little bit. But every little section is broken down. This one even has the word count broken down, like approximately the first 3,000 words should be introducing your character, and then the next 3,000 words should be the inciting incident. You don't have to follow this. This is just, if you're really struggling to come up with stuff, it can like be helpful to have a step along the way. So your mission is to create some kind of outline for your story. It can be really basic, 3 acts. This is what's going to happen in the beginning. The middle is always the hardest for me to plot out. So literally you might just write, in the middle, they learn this stuff and do things, and it's great. Yay. And then Act 3, the climax. Who are they battling at the end? Are they going to win? What are they getting out of it? Or you can use the 7-point structure, get a little bit more specific, or you can dial it up with the 27-point structure if you want, or you can just kind of create your own, whatever ideas are coming into your head. This happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. Just kind of make sure you're following the general hero's journey 3-act structure. Like, make sure you have a beginning, middle, and an end. There's a climax, your character, there's a call to adventure, they face these trials, blah, blah, blah. You don't have to know everything. Just get a general outline idea for where your story is going to go.